To the ancient Celts, time was not a straight line that marched endlessly forward. It was a circle, vast, breathing, and eternal, turning over and over upon itself like the wheel of the seasons. The year did not begin with birth, nor end with death. It flowed, endlessly repeating, through light and darkness, decay and renewal. Everything that had happened would happen again, just as the sun dies every evening and is reborn each dawn. This belief shaped every rhythm of their lives. The Celts saw themselves not as masters of time, but as participants in a divine pattern, a cosmic dance of dying and becoming. They measured their year through great fire festivals, each one a spoke on the wheel: Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain. Of these, 2 were the pillars: Beltane in the spring, when the world bloomed with light and fertility, and Samhain in autumn, when light fell to shadow and the earth surrendered to sleep. These 2 halves, bright and dark, were not enemies but twins, each necessary for the other to exist. For them, the world did not grow old, it turned. The idea of progress of time advancing towards something new would have been foreign, almost absurd. What mattered was balance, the eternal return. To live in harmony with the wheel meant understanding when to plant, when to reap, when to mourn, and when to rest. The Celts believed that to ignore the turning of the seasons was to step outside the rhythm of creation itself, a dangerous act that invited the wrath of unseen powers. Samhain, in particular, was the hinge upon which this wheel turned. It marked the boundary not only between seasons, but between worlds, life and death, order and chaos, seen and unseen. To the Celts, the universe was layered like a spiral, with the mortal world resting beside realms of gods, ancestors, and spirits. These realms were usually sealed, but during Samhain, the spiral loosened, pathways opened, the borders bled. In this circular vision of time, beginnings and endings were illusions. Death was merely another form of birth. When a man died, his spirit did not vanish. It returned, perhaps as the wind, perhaps as the seed of a future harvest. This idea was not comforting in a modern sense. It did not erase fear, but it gave that fear a purpose. The Celts accepted death as part of the breathing rhythm of the world. That rhythm was sacred. The Druidic priesthood guarded its secrets, ensuring that fire festivals aligned with the movements of the moon and stars. They believed that the heavens mirrored the earth, that the pattern above dictated the pattern below. Each Samhain, the fires were lit not at random, but when constellations signaled the death of summer's Sunday. To light a fire at the wrong moment was to invite imbalance, and imbalance invited disaster. Imagine living within such a system where every action, even lighting a hearth or cutting a tree, was woven into the heartbeat of the cosmos. Life was ritual. Existence itself was a form of devotion. And within this living circle, there was no true end, only descent into shadow, followed by the slow return of dawn. This worldview explains why the Celts never saw darkness as evil in the way later faiths would. The dark half of the year was not the enemy of light, but its mirror. In winter's silence, the seeds of renewal slept. The frost and the rot were necessary. The earth must die before it can live again. Samhain was not just the end of summer, it was the moment the world held its breath before beginning anew. It's said that the Druids marked this passage through fire, twin flames representing the sun's waning strength and its promise of return. People and cattle passed between them for purification, symbolically stepping through death and out again into life. The smoke was prayer, the heat, remembrance. Everything was part of the cycle, even fear, because in a world ruled by the turning wheel, nothing was ever lost, only transformed. The departed returned in dreams or in the rustle of autumn leaves. The gods walked disguised among mortals. Even the darkness was not final. It was a necessary silence before the next heartbeat of the Sunday. This ancient rhythm still hums beneath our modern calendars, though we have forgotten its sound. We divide our time by clocks and years, by beginnings and deadlines, but the old world moved by pulse and season. The Celts did not count time, they listened to it. They watched how the wind changed, how the light fell differently on the hills, how the animals shifted in their rest. Each sign was part of a greater language, the voice of the living world whispering, "Turn, turn, turn." To understand Halloween, truly understand it, one must step back into that older rhythm. The masks, the firelight, the fascination with death, all are remnants of a worldview where death was not an interruption, but a movement in the eternal dance. The Celts did not fear the circle's closing, because they knew it always began again. And so, as the wheel turned toward its dark half, people gathered beneath the dying sun, aware that time itself was folding. The harvest was done, the animals were counted, and soon the first frost would creep across the fields. In that stillness between seasons, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air shimmered with the sense of something vast shifting the wheel, clicking once more into its shadowed groove. To the Celts, that sound was not dread, it was awe. It was the sound of the universe continuing its eternal rotation, the whisper of death moving gently into life once more. Before we can understand why the Celts feared that night, why they lit their fires and hid their faces beneath masks, we must step backward, far beyond the smoke and the ritual, into the very heart of how they saw the world itself. Because to them, fear was not chaos. It was part of a divine rhythm, one beat in the eternal pulse of creation and decay. Every terror, every harvest, every death, all of it was bound to a great pattern that turned endlessly, like the wheel of the heavens above them. The Celts did not see time as we do a line moving forward from birth to death, from past to future. To them, time was alive. It curved, folded, and returned upon itself. It was a circle, breathing. Each season did not replace the last, but completed it, feeding it, echoing it. Every ending carried the seed of a beginning. This wheel of time was marked by sacred points, festivals that celebrated the balance between light and darkness, fire and frost, life and the silence beneath the soil. Four stood above all others: Imbolc, Beltane, Lughnasadh, and Samhain. Together, they formed the spokes of the great celestial wheel. Of these, Beltane and Samhain were the twin gates, the two breaths of the year. Beltane opened the bright half, when life surged through the world in warmth, love, and fertility. Samhain opened the dark half, when the sun weakened, the fields withered, and the dead began to stir in their mounds. Between them, the world turned light, collapsing into darkness, and darkness quietly giving birth to light again. It was not a war, but a cycle. The Celts never believed one side could win. If light triumphed forever, the world would burn to ash. If darkness ruled eternally, all growth would cease. The dance between the two, the dying and the becoming, was the heartbeat of the universe. The transition between these halves was sacred and dangerous. At these hinge points, the world was in flux. The fabric of reality loosened. The air shimmered with tension. Especially at Samhain, when summer's breath finally died and the earth fell silent, the Celts believed that time itself became unstable, as if the clock of the universe hesitated, unsure whether to continue. It is in these moments, when the pattern wavered, that the supernatural could slip through, not because evil sought entry, but because the boundaries themselves blurred. The living could glimpse the dead, and the dead could reach across the veil. The stars seemed closer, the wind spoke clearer, and fate itself could be read in the embers of the dying fire. To live in such a world was to live with reverence and with fear. The Celts did not dominate nature. They listened to it. They read the movement of clouds, the tilt of the sun, the quiet breathing of the forest. Every sign was part of a greater language spoken by the gods. To ignore it was to step out of harmony, to fall off the wheel, and once you fell, you might never find your way back. Modern minds find this strange. We divide life into seconds, years, centuries, measuring it, mastering it, as though time were a river we could dam and redirect. But for the Celts, time could not be controlled, only honored. It did not move, it turned. It did not pass, it returned. They built their rituals, their myths, and their understanding of the soul upon this belief. To die was not to vanish, but to spiral back into the pattern, perhaps in another form, another life, another dream. The ancestors were not gone. They were waiting, circling in the mist, whispering through stone and fire. When the wheel turned towards Samhain, it was not only the season that changed, it was the balance of all things. The light retreated beneath the earth, just as the sun god himself was said to descend into the other world, carrying the fire of life into the realm of shadow. The people above honored his journey with flame, guiding him through the dark, ensuring that the cycle would begin anew. And so, Samhain was not simply an ending. It was the great pause, the breath between death and rebirth, when the world stood still and waited for the first spark to return. The Celts stood in awe of that silence. It was holy, and it was terrifying. For them, that silence was proof of the pattern, proof that even the darkest night was not forever, only a turning of the wheel. And every time the wheel turned, they were reminded that life, too, was circular. All that dies will rise again. The wheel has turned. The light half of the year has ended, and the great breath of summer finally exhales its last. The Celts called this moment Samhain, a word that translates simply and without poetry as summer's end. But within those two words lived a quiet terror, for it meant not only the fading of warmth and color, but the arrival of the dark, the cold, and the fragile silence of survival. To the ancient people of Ireland and Britain, this was the most decisive turn of the year. The harvest had been gathered, the granaries filled, and the earth itself seemed to sigh in exhaustion. The lush green world that had fed them now began to rot beneath their feet. The sun sank earlier each day, and the once joyful fields stood stripped and skeletal. The world was contracting, curling in on itself, preparing to endure the long sleep of winter. And yet, this moment grim, as it was carried a sacred necessity. It was not a tragedy, but a reckoning. The Celts understood that to live through the dark half of the year, something had to die. The word Samhain did not speak of despair, but of acceptance. It named the truth that all life must give way, so that life can continue. For the communities of the Iron Age, survival depended on preparation. The crops were in, the tools were mended, and the livestock were brought down from the summer pastures on the high hills to the safety of the valleys. These herds were the living wealth of the tribe, milk, meat, and muscle. But the land could not feed them all through the barren months ahead. The stored fodder was finite, the winter long, and so came the cull. It was a season of blood, as real and necessary as the turning of the stars. The weakest animals were slaughtered before the frost set in. Their meat was salted, smoked, or hung to dry, the lifeline of the months to come. In this grim economy of survival, death became an act of mercy. Each animal taken now was one less mouth to feed, and one more chance for the tribe to endure until spring. To the modern mind, such practicality might seem cold, but to the Celts, it was sacred realism. The end of summer was not symbolic, it was physical, visceral, written in blood. The people could not separate themselves from the rhythms of decay. They lived within them, The stench of smoke and meat hung in the air alongside the scent of dying leaves. The land and the body mirrored each other, both shedding, both enduring. Around every settlement, signs of the great transition could be seen. The hearth fires burned lower, the laughter of the harvest faded into silence, and the days shortened like the beating of a slowing heart. The Celts felt this deeply. They did not fight the dark. They folded into it, trusting that it would pass. But in that folding, in that surrender, they felt the thinness of the world. They understood Samhain as a liminal time, a space that belonged to neither summer nor winter, neither life nor death. It was the hinge on which the universe turned, and in its creaking motion, reality itself seemed to loosen. The rules that governed the world, light and dark, breath and stillness, faltered. It was said that the veil between realms grew thin, not because ghosts were restless, but because creation itself paused to take a breath. In that fragile breath, the living felt the nearness of the dead. The boundary between body and spirit blurred, just as the border between light and shadow vanished at dusk. Every element of nature seemed to echo the same truth, that death and life were not opposites, but partners in a single, unbroken cycle. For those who lived close to the land, this was not a metaphor. The evidence was everywhere, in the cold meat curing in the smokehouse, in the bare branches scratching the sky, in the bite of the wind that smelled of ash and endings. The world itself seemed to whisper, "You are not apart from this, you are part of it." And so the people met the darkness not with denial, but with ritual. Fires were lit not to chase the dark away, but to remind the tribe of their place within it. Each flame was both a weapon and a prayer, a spark of defiance against the encroaching void. The fires marked not victory, but balance, a promise that the light, though dying, would one day rise again. In this way, Samhain was less a night of celebration and more a solemn contract between humankind and nature. The people did not ask the darkness to leave. They asked to survive its passing. Every ritual, every offering, every spark that flew upward into the night sky was part of that agreement. It is strange, perhaps, to think of such bleakness as beautiful, but to the Celts, it was. The dying of summer was not just an end, it was a sacred transformation. They saw in the decay of the fields the same pattern that governed all things, that death is not destruction, but renewal in disguise. This belief gave them strength. It allowed them to look upon the blood of the cull, the blackness of the sky, the cold silence of the soil, and see not horror, but harmony. Samhain was the mirror in which they faced the truth that every spark of life is borrowed from the darkness and one day must be given back. As the final fires dimmed and the long frost crept down from the hills, the people drew close around their hearths, the smell of smoke and salt thick in the air. They whispered prayers to their ancestors and watched the embers fade. Somewhere in that dying glow, they believed, slept the promise of the next dawn, a promise that even the longest winter could not erase. The wheel had turned again, summer was over, and in the quiet of that ending, the Celts listened for the sound beneath all things, the slow, steady rhythm of the world, breathing, waiting, turning once more. The harvest was done. The fields lay bare. Smoke curled from the dying bonfires, and the cold breath of November began to creep across the hills. The world had gone quiet, but beneath that stillness, something ancient was stirring. The Celts believed that Samhain marked more than the end of summer. It was a doorway, a threshold between worlds. They called this the liminal time, when the earth itself stood between breaths, and the boundaries that divided the living from the dead grew thin, fragile, and strange. To understand this, one must step into the Celtic imagination, a world that did not divide spirit and matter, dream and waking, as we do today. To them, reality was not a wall but a veil, a shimmering, breathing film that separated the mortal realm from the unseen one. And on this night of Samhain, the veil grew translucent, as if the universe itself were exhaling, revealing what lay beyond. The Celts had a word for this borderland betwixt and between. It was not here nor there, not day, not night. It was the twilight of existence, a space that belonged to no one and to everyone. In this strange equilibrium, all opposites could meet, gods and men, life and death, the sacred and the cursed. As the fires dimmed and the stars sharpened, the people felt the press of invisible things. The air seemed to hum with presence. The wind carried voices, not speech, but memory. The dogs grew restless, staring at nothing. The water in the wells turned dark and still. Every creak of the trees, every flicker of flame, felt like the world whispering, "They are near." This belief did not come from fear alone, but from experience, the slow, inherited memory of countless generations living close to the land. For the Celts, the earth itself was alive, layered with worlds upon worlds. Beneath every hill was another realm, every lake a mirror of some divine reflection. The other world, Tir na Nog, the land of youth, was not distant or unreachable. It lay beside this one, separated only by a breath, a shadow, a dream. And so, on Samhain, when that veil fluttered open, those who had gone before could cross. Ancestors, spirits, fae not all kind, not all cruel, wandered the paths they once knew, drawn by the warmth of human hearths. Some sought remembrance, some sought mischief, some merely followed the scent of firelight. For the living, this mingling of worlds was both blessing and danger. To honor it was necessary, to ignore it was perilous. Offerings of food and drink were placed upon doorsteps and hearths, gifts for wandering souls, invitations of peace. Candles were lit to guide the lost. Doors were left slightly open, not to welcome strangers, but to acknowledge the unseen. Yet, not all who crossed the veil were gentle. Among the Celts' stories were tales of the Aos Sí, the people of the mounds, ancient gods whose time had passed, now dwelling beneath earth and stone. On this night, they too walked abroad, cloaked in mist, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. To meet them was to risk enchantment or disappearance. To survive the liminal night, people disguised themselves. The first masks were not playful, they were spells. Hides, bones, ashes. Each disguise was meant to confuse, to blur the line between mortal and spirit. For if the dead mistook you for one of their own, they would let you pass untouched. It was, in every sense, a night of transformation. Men became spirits, spirits borrowed faces of men. The world turned inside out. The known and the unknown sat side by side before the same fire. And above it all, the Druids, those enigmatic priests and poets, kept their solemn vigil. The Druids understood the power of this threshold better than any. To them, Samhain was not only a night of spirits, but of knowledge. When the veil thinned, the patterns of fate became visible. The stars, the embers, the flight of birds, all were messages, if one had the courage to read them. In the flicker of the sacred fires, the Druids sought prophecy, warnings for the tribe, omens for the year to come. It was said that to glimpse the other world was to see truth without language. Some Druids fasted, some walked alone through the dark moors, some cast bones or marked the ashes, searching for the voice beneath silence. They did not call it magic. To them, it was simply listening to the rhythm that tied every living and dead thing together. The people, meanwhile, huddled in their huts, trusting that their fires and offerings would hold the darkness at bay. They whispered old names of ancestors, of gods not as prayers but as reminders that the bond still lived. The crackle of fire sounded like a heartbeat, and in that sound, they felt the echo of all who had come before them. As midnight deepened, the veil reached its thinnest. A stillness fell that was unlike any other, a stillness that felt alive. If one stood outside then, the world seemed suspended, caught between inhale and exhale. The stars burned with unnatural clarity. The wind changed direction. Even time felt hesitant, as if afraid to move forward. Then, slowly, the first frost gathered on the grass. The breath of the earth cooled. The veil began to close. The night exhaled its mystery, and the two worlds drifted apart again, their edges still trembling from the touch. The people did not celebrate. They did not cheer. They simply watched, in awe and humility, as the veil fell back into place, for they knew it would open again. The wheel would turn. The night would come once more. And when it did, they would be ready, masked, silent, reverent, standing once again at the edge of two worlds. The fires of Samhain were more than warmth. They were the heart of the tribe, the bridge between the living and the unseen, and the tool of those who walked between both the Druids. When the Celts gathered on that long, cold night, it was the Druids who stood at the center of the flame's circle. They were priests, poets, and seers, the keepers of sacred time and the interpreters of divine will. To them, the world was a text written by gods in the language of stars and seasons, and it was their duty to read it aloud to humanity. Each Samhain, all hearths in the villages were extinguished. Homes went dark, the fires deliberately allowed to die. This was not neglect but ritual, a symbolic death of light, mirroring the waning of the Sunday. The darkness was absolute, and for a few trembling moments, the people felt the weight of the void. Then, from the central hill, a mound often chosen for its alignment with the stars, the Druids kindled a single, sacred flame. This fire was born not from chance, but from order. Sparks were drawn from friction, wood rubbed by ritual stones, sometimes within a wheel that mirrored the turning of the heavens. The Druids whispered invocations as they worked, not begging the gods, but awakening the balance that held both creation and destruction in their grasp. When the fire finally leapt to life, a cry went up from the darkness. The people exhaled as if the world itself had been reborn. The sacred bonfire, known as the Tine Knam, the fire of bones, was fed with offerings, the bones of animals culled during the harvest, symbols of what had been sacrificed for survival. The flames crackled high, red and gold, carrying the smoke skyward, a signal to gods, ancestors, and unseen watchers that the tribe still lived. Around that fire the people gathered. They danced, they sang, but always with reverence. The Druids cast herbs into the flames, yarrow, oak, and mistletoe, to read the shapes of smoke and sparks. Each flicker was a message. The future, they believed, lived in the behavior of the fire. Prophecy and purification were one. Those who walked between the twin bonfires were cleansed of misfortune. Those who dared to leap through the smoke were reborn. It was said that animals led through the flame's shadow would be protected for the year to come. In these acts, death and life intertwined again, the dead offering safety to the living offering reverence to the dead. To outsiders, such rites seemed barbaric. The Roman writers who first recorded the Druid ceremonies, Julius Caesar among them, painted them as sorcerers and sacrificers, men of superstition and cruelty. They told stories of wicker effigies burned with human captives, of forests echoing with chants to forgotten gods. But Roman ink was not truth. It was weapon. Caesar's words were meant to conquer with fear before his armies conquered with iron. Yet, beneath the distortion, fragments of truth glimmer. The Druids did work with fire and sacrifice, not in the name of bloodlust, but of cosmic order. The death of one thing, properly given, sustained the balance of all. In a world where survival depended on the turning of the sun and the mercy of unseen forces, ritual was not cruelty, it was communication. Their fires, far from savage, were profoundly symbolic. Fire was the element of transformation, the alchemy that bridged heaven and earth. It devoured and purified, destroyed and renewed. To light it was to mirror the sun's journey, the descent into darkness and the promise of return. As the flames danced, the Druids read more than fate. They read meaning itself. They watched the sparks drift skyward like souls released from flesh. They saw how the wind bent the smoke, how the embers glowed, how the light reflected on the faces of the gathered tribe. These were signs not of doom, but of belonging. The living world and the invisible one breathed together through the fire's pulse. In some accounts, the Druids were said to pass their staves through the flame and touch them to the foreheads of children, marking them with soot, a sign of protection and remembrance. The ash that remained at dawn was gathered carefully, mixed with water, and spread upon the thresholds of homes. Every family carried a spark of the sacred fire back to relight their hearths. In this act, the community's soul was rekindled. Imagine that moment, the last dark corners of the village glowing one by one, flames flickering to life, each born from the same sacred source. 1,000 separate hearts, beating in unison. The night had been faced, the balance restored. To the Druids, Samhain was a conversation not between gods and mortals, but between the living and the pattern of existence itself. The fire was both question and answer, a mirror in which they glimpsed the eternal dance of destruction and renewal. And when dawn came, pale and cold, the sacred fire was left to fade. The smoke drifted east toward the rising sun, and the people knew that they had survived the crossing once more. The veil had thinned and thickened again. The world had paused and resumed, and the wheel, the great burning wheel of time, had turned another notch toward the dark. But for that one night, under the watch of the Druids' flame, they had stood in the heart of mystery close enough to feel the breath of gods. When the sacred fire of the Druids blazed high against the black sky, the people knew the night was not yet over. Samhain had many faces. It was the end of the year, the return of the dead, and above all, the night of prophecy. It was said that when the veil thinned and the two worlds brushed against one another, time itself became fluid. The past and the future mingled in the air like smoke. On this night, one could ask questions of destiny, and if the signs were read correctly, the fire would answer. As the flames leapt and hissed, the Druids watched closely. They were not mere priests, they were interpreters of flame, readers of omen and breath. The fire, to them, was a living being, a messenger of the gods, an oracle of the Sunday. It devoured, it revealed, it transformed. Every spark that rose into the sky carried a fragment of a soul, a thought, or a dream. The Druids claimed that if one watched with pure intent, they might glimpse in the smoke the faces of ancestors, or the shape of what was to come. Some saw visions of war, others of union, others only silence, and that silence too was an answer. The people gathered in circles around the great bonfire. Their shadows danced like spirits, and the night hummed with murmured invocations. There was no distinction between prayer and magic. The act of asking was the magic itself. Each heart carried its own question. Will I survive the winter? Will the child be born healthy? Will my love return? The Druids threw sacred herbs into the blaze oak bark, rowan, juniper, and apple seeds, each with a meaning older than memory. When the fire snapped, it meant acceptance. When it hissed and smoked, it meant refusal. The rhythm of the flames became a divine heartbeat. But prophecy did not belong to the Druids alone. On this night, ordinary people also sought visions, guided by the flicker of candlelight and the whispers of old women who remembered the ways. They practiced divination simple, symbolic acts meant to glimpse the will of fate. One of the oldest customs was apple scrying. Apples, the fruit of the other world, were believed to carry messages from beyond. A young woman might peel an apple in one long strip and throw it over her shoulder. The shape it formed on the ground would reveal the first letter of her future lover's name. Others cut the apple crosswise to reveal the five-pointed star hidden within the pentagram of life, the heart of knowledge. Another practice involved nuts placed in the fire. Each nut represented a person, a pair of lovers, or a choice. If the nuts burned quietly together, harmony was promised. If they burst apart, separation or betrayal awaited. These were not games, but acts of reverence, ways to listen to the same divine rhythm the Druids heard in the fire. In the flicker of flame and the hiss of wood, the people believed the future spoke softly. Sometimes the answer came as a vision, sometimes as a feeling, an intuition that lingered long after the fire died. The Celts did not demand certainty. They sought pattern, meaning, balance. To them, fate was not a straight road, but a river one could not control its flow, but one could learn to move with it. At the height of the night, when the moon stood cold and silver above the smoke, the Druids performed their own rites of foresight. They read the movement of stars, the cries of ravens, the shifting color of flame. Some walked barefoot through embers to prove purity of spirit. Others fasted for days to enter trance. It was not spectacle, but communion and exchange between mortal and cosmic breath. Around them, the villagers carried out quieter rituals. They extinguished the torches from the central fire and brought a single coal home to relight their own hearths. This act was both practical and symbolic. It joined every home to the sacred flame. In that unity, the tribe renewed its bond. No household stood alone. Before dawn, the fire began to die. Its ashes were sacred. The Druids scattered them upon the fields, blessing the soil for spring's return. Children were marked on their foreheads with a trace of soot protection against illness and the wandering dead. To touch the ash was to carry the year's memory into the dark months ahead. As the people turned home, the sky was already paling, and the world seemed changed. The rituals were complete, the veil beginning to close. The night of prophecy had passed, but its echo remained. The smell of smoke lingered on their clothes, the taste of ash on their tongues. Each carried a private sign, a silent message from the fire. They had looked into the heart of flame and seen themselves reflected small, transient, but part of something endless. Samhain had shown them again what they already knew, that to live was to walk continually between what is and what will be, between shadow and light, between death and the promise of return. The fires burned low. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of smoke and prophecy into the coming winter. And far above, the stars wheeled slowly, silent witnesses to a people who still remembered how to listen. When the fires of prophecy had burned low and the night stood silent once more, the Celts knew that Samhain was not yet finished. The veil might have thinned, the omens spoken, but something older and deeper still waited beyond the firelight, something that did not belong to gods or mortals alone. They called them the Aos Sí, the people of the mounds, ancient, radiant, and perilous. Once they had been divine, rulers of an age when men had not yet tamed the land. But time, even in myth, consumes all things. The Aos Sí had been cast beneath the earth, exiled into hollow hills and barrow mounds, their palaces buried under grass and stone. Yet on the night of Samhain, when the earth's breath slowed and the boundary faltered, the doors of those hills began to open. The mounds Side were more than tombs. They were doorways, thresholds between realms. Every village knew their locations. Soft green hills that hummed faintly in the wind, rings of standing stones where the air shimmered oddly, caves that exhaled cold air even in summer. To wander near them on Samhain night was to risk vanishing. Legends say that inside those hills the old gods still feast. Their halls glow with firelight that never dies. Music echoes there, woven from sorrow and ecstasy alike. To hear it was to lose one's sense of time. An hour among the Sidhe could mean a century in the mortal world. And yet, despite their beauty, the Aos Sí were not merciful beings. They were the old order, cast aside by the new. When humanity rose and worship changed, the gods of the earth became restless shadows, half remembered, half resented. Some said they grew jealous of mankind's world. Others said they merely mourned the silence. But whatever their reason, on Samhain night, they were free to walk again. The Celts feared and honored them in equal measure. Offerings were laid upon doorsteps, bowls of milk, pieces of bread, cups of ale to appease the passing hosts. Those who forgot risked misfortune. Cattle gone lame, milk soured overnight, children struck with fever. The Aos Sí did not punish in anger, but in balance. To them, neglect disrupted the sacred rhythm of respect between worlds. In some regions, people called them by gentler names: the good neighbors, the hidden ones, the fair folk, not out of affection, but caution. To speak their true name aloud was to summon attention, and attention from them was perilous. Words had weight in the old world, and names were bridges. It was said that the Sidhe could appear in many guises: a glimmer in the mist, a woman in white standing by the riverbank, a horseman cloaked in shadow, a troop of riders whose hooves made no sound. They could bless or blight, heal or harm, depending on how the living greeted them. Some stories told of mortals lured into their dance, a spiral of laughter and song only to vanish, never aging, trapped in eternal revelry beneath the hills. Others spoke of bargains, a life exchanged for fortune, a song traded for beauty, a promise whispered in the dark that bound generations to come. The Druids, those mediators of light and shadow, warned the people not to interfere with the Sidhe. On Samhain, they said, walk softly, speak little, and leave gifts by the path. The Aos Sí were not evil, they were the remnants of a cosmic order, older than humanity. Their morality followed laws beyond understanding. To insult them was to disturb a balance that reached into the bones of the earth. Still, the human heart is curious. There were always those who went seeking the mounds, hunters who followed strange lights, lovers who heard familiar voices calling from the mist, musicians drawn to ghostly tunes carried on the wind. Few returned, and those who did came back changed their eyes distant, their words dreamlike, as if part of them had been left behind. One tale tells of a chieftain's son who disappeared during Samhain. A year later, he returned, or what appeared to be him. His face was the same, but his voice carried an echo, and his shadow lagged behind him in torchlight. When the fire touched his skin, he winced, as if burned by truth itself. The Druids whispered that he had dined in the halls of the Sidhe, and that no mortal could eat their food without forfeiting something of the soul. Such stories were not meant merely to frighten. They reminded people that existence itself was layered, that what we see is only the surface of a greater depth. The mounds were wounds in the world where those layers touched. The Aos Sí were the guardians or prisoners of that in-between space. As the night of Samhain deepened, villagers would sometimes see lights moving on distant hills, or hear faint music drifting through the fog. The cautious stayed indoors. The brave whispered blessings. And somewhere, under the weight of soil and memory, the people of the mounds stirred their ancient eyes, flickering open at the scent of smoke and blood. When dawn approached, The wind shifted. The cold retreated a little. The mounds fell silent once more. The veil was closing, and the Aos Sí withdrew to their unseen halls. But the people knew they would return. Every year, as summer's end drew near, the doorways would open again. And so the Celts lived with them, not above them, not apart from them, but beside them. Fear was the price of coexistence, and respect was its shield. For in a world where gods slept beneath the earth, the wise knew better than to walk too loudly. As the people of the mounds stirred beneath the soil, the Celts above learned to move softly, to breathe in rhythm with the unseen. They knew that on Samhain night, to be noticed was dangerous, and to be remembered by the wrong kind of spirit could mean ruin. And so, they hid. But hiding, to the Celts, was never cowardice. It was reverence, a way of stepping aside, while the world's deeper forces passed through. Thus began one of the most enduring traditions of all, the wearing of masks and the giving of offerings. When the fires dimmed and the wind began to shift, the villagers would cloak themselves in disguise. Some wrapped in animal pelts, others wore skulls or horns, painted their faces with ash, or blackened their eyes with soot. They became unrecognizable, unclaimed by the living world. To the wandering spirits, they were neither friend nor foe, merely shadows moving among shadows. The mask, in Celtic belief, was a threshold, a tool of transformation. It blurred the line between body and spirit, between mortal and divine. To put one on was not simply to hide, it was to become something else. For a few hours, one could walk unseen between realms, protected by ambiguity. There was power in this act. The Druids spoke of masks as sacred symbols, the face of man merged with the face of beast, the known with the unknown. The world itself wore masks, the moon covering the sun, the frost cloaking the earth, death disguising life. Humanity merely imitated what the gods had done since the dawn of time. Children wore hollowed gourds with candles glowing inside, their faint light flickering through carved eyes and mouths. Some say these lanterns represented spirits trapped between worlds. Others say they were meant to ward them off. Firelight, shaped and carried by human hands, became both beacon and barrier. But masks alone were not enough. The Celts knew that appeasement was as vital as concealment. As the dead and the Aos Sí walked the earth, they demanded acknowledgement, a token of hospitality, a reminder that the bond between worlds still held. Thus, every home became an altar. Bread, fruit, milk, and honey were placed on thresholds. Meat was left on stones near the fields. Small coins were tossed into springs and wells, whose waters were believed to run close to the other world. Even the poorest families found something to give, for to give nothing was to risk everything. This was the origin of the offerings, or treats, as centuries later they would be called in another tongue. But in these early days, there was no sweetness in the exchange. It was an act of survival, a pact of respect between the mortal and the mysterious. The offerings were not only for the dead, but for balance itself. The Celts did not see good and evil as opposites, but as tides, each necessary, each demanding tribute. The food left on doorsteps was not payment, but harmony, a small gesture to remind the other world that the living still remembered their place. As midnight deepened, masked figures wandered the paths between villages. Some carried torches, others silent bundles of offerings to lay at crossroads, places believed to exist in two worlds at once. The crossroads were sacred to the Celts, where choices met, where fate bent, where one could whisper to the unseen and perhaps be heard. They say that if you stood at a crossroads on Samhain and held your breath long enough, you might hear the names of those soon to die whispered in the wind. Few dared to listen, for prophecy was never kind to the curious. Yet the tradition persisted, a strange dance of fear and reverence, of giving and hiding. Even the Druids took part in disguise. They wore robes of black or white, adorned with symbols of moon and bone. To lead the rituals safely through the night, they too must blend into the fabric of myth, unseen by what they sought to command. Some masks were terrifying, carved to mimic the twisted faces of spirits, while others were beautiful, serene, painted with swirls and marks that told of stars, rivers, and dreams. Each one was personal, a reflection of how its wearer perceived the other world, fearful, reverent, or both. Through these masks, the people learned a strange wisdom, that identity itself was fragile, shifting, and temporary. For one night, they could dissolve the boundary between self and world. The hunter might become the stag, the maiden a ghost, the elder a god. In losing their faces, they found humility, the understanding that all living beings shared the same cycle of transformation. And in their offerings, they found peace. The act of giving, of laying down bread to the night, was a small surrender to mystery. It said, "We do not command the dark, we coexist with it." As dawn approached, the masked ones removed their disguises. Some burned them in the fading bonfires, sending their faces back to smoke. Others buried them at the edges of fields, to return their borrowed forms to the soil. The gifts left for the spirits were gone, taken by wind, animals, or perhaps something else. The people did not question. To have survived the night was enough. The balance had been kept, the veil honored, the living spared. The masks had done their work, and the offerings had carried their message. Respect the dark, and it will pass gently over you. Thus, each year the Celts repeated this ritual, a dance of humility, beneath an infinite sky. It was not fear that guided them, but awareness, a quiet knowledge that to live safely in a world of unseen powers, one must learn not to be seen at all. And so the night of Samhain became a masquerade of survival, a communion of faces and flames, of giving and disappearing, where even the simplest act of leaving bread on a doorstep became a sacred gesture to the eternal rhythm of death and return. Beyond the flickering light of the bonfires, past the fields stripped bare and the sleeping villages, the land began to change. There, in the mist and silence, rose the hollow hills, gentle, round slopes covered in grass, where the wind moved strangely and the ground seemed to hum. To the Celts, these were not mere hills. They were doorways, breathing places in the skin of the earth, where the world above met the one below. They said that in ancient days, before men ruled the land, the gods had lived openly upon these plains. When their time ended, they retreated underground, not in defeat, but in transformation. Their palaces of light and gold sank into the soil, hidden behind the veil of eternity. The hills above became their tombs, and their thrones at once. And though covered in moss and time, they still pulsed faintly with divine memory. Every region had its own mound, the Hill of Tara, where kings once communed with the unseen, Newgrange, whose stones aligned with the solstice sun, and countless smaller barrows scattered through the countryside, each whispering of forgotten power. To wander near them was to walk the edge of two realities. On Samhain night, the Celts believed these hills awakened. The grass upon them shimmered faintly, as though lit from within. Strange music drifted from their roots, haunting tunes that pulled at the heart, filled with both sorrow and desire. Travelers spoke of doors appearing in the hillside, glowing faintly like the surface of moonlit water. Some saw shadowy figures passing through, neither walking nor floating, crowned in light. The wise kept their distance. The foolhardy were never seen again. Those who vanished were said to have been taken beneath, drawn into the hollow hills by the people of the mounds. There, time moved differently. A single night of revelry might stretch into centuries. The lost would return if they returned at all to find their children's children long dead, their homes turned to dust. But not all who entered did so unwillingly. Some went seeking what the mortal world could not give: forbidden knowledge, eternal youth, a glimpse of beauty untainted by decay. For the Sidhe were not only fearsome, they were alluring. Their world was said to be perfect. No hunger, no pain, no winter. Yet perfection, the Druids warned, is its own prison. The songs of the Sidhe, it was said, could pierce the heart like silver. They promised love, glory, and endless joy. But to accept their invitation was to surrender the soul. For within the hollow hills, every pleasure was eternal, and so was every sorrow. Those who ate the Sidhe's food were bound to them forever. The fruit of their feasts shone like jewels, but once tasted, no mortal could again stomach earthly bread. The wine burned like sunlight and erased all memory of pain and of self. The mortals who remained there became pale and still, smiling forever, their laughter hollow as the hills themselves. The Druids called the mounds Sidan, the peaceful places. Yet peace, in this sense, meant not tranquility but stillness, the silence of something that has stopped changing. They warned the people, do not linger near the hollow hills, for what does not move cannot live. Still, fascination endured. Farmers left offerings on the slopes, milk poured into the soil, honey left on stones not as worship, but as appeasement. To plow too close was folly. To cut trees growing upon a mound was sacrilege. Those who ignored the warning often paid dearly. Stories tell of a farmer who struck a mound with his plow, breaking open a small hollow. That night, his house was filled with strange music, and his crops withered by morning. Others tell of a young woman who vanished while singing by a hill. For years afterward, her voice could be heard faintly beneath the earth whenever the wind blew from the north. Yet the hollow hills were not wholly malevolent. Some who entered returned blessed, touched by inspiration, gifted with song or poetry. The bards claimed their art came from such encounters. The Aos Sí were keepers of beauty as well as mystery. To meet them was to taste both enchantment and terror, for they revealed that the divine was not gentle, only vast. The hills themselves seemed alive. Animals would not graze upon them. Birds circled, but never landed. In winter, they stayed green when all else died. In summer, they shone under moonlight like wet stone. Even now, centuries later, travelers in Ireland speak of such places, lonely mounds where technology falters, where sound carries strangely, where the air feels heavy with presence. Perhaps, as the Celts believed, those places are still doors. Perhaps the hollow hills never truly closed. To the people of old, they were a reminder of the thinness of reality, that beneath every quiet landscape lay a pulse, a memory, a threshold. To live in such a world was to live with wonder and fear entwined, knowing that at any moment, the ordinary earth beneath one's feet might sigh open like a mouth, whispering your name. And so the Celts walked softly through their lands. They spoke blessings when passing mounds, left offerings in silence, and taught their children never to shout upon the hills. The wise understood. These places were not to be conquered, but respected, for they belonged not only to the dead, but to the earth's dreaming self. As dawn broke on Samhain morning, the mist clung thick upon those slopes. The fires in the villages flickered low, and the hills gleamed faintly in the pale light, silent, patient, eternal. Beneath them, perhaps, music still played. Beneath the hollow hills, where no sunlight reached and no mortal hour passed, the eternal feast was said to unfold. Its tables stretched beyond sight, its music echoed through endless corridors of stone and gold, and its guests, both divine and damned, danced without ever growing weary. To the Celts, this was not a legend meant only to frighten, but a vision of the otherworld's seduction. For what could be more terrible than joy that never ends? They said that once every Samhain, when the veil thinned and the mounds opened, the halls of the Aos Sí awakened in full splendor. Torches of blue fire burned without smoke. Cups refilled themselves. The air shimmered with the scent of honey, clover, and blood. Harps played songs no human hand could master, melodies that stirred both rapture and despair. At the center of it all sat the fair queen, radiant and cold, her crown woven of starlight and bone. Her eyes, they said, were like pools of still water, beautiful, bottomless, and dangerous to gaze into for too long. Around her reclined the lords of the Cide, warriors in silver armor, poets whose words bent reality, and spirits who had once been gods, but now ruled shadows. They drank not wine but memory. Every toast was a story, every cup a fragment of something lost. To dine among them was to feel the edges of one's soul dissolve. The Celts believed that mortals who strayed too close to the mounds could hear the feast faintly, like the echo of a song carried through the soil. The music was irresistible. It promised warmth against the cold, light against the dark. Many travelers, lonely or proud, followed that sound into the hills and were never seen again. What awaited them was not torture, but eternity. They entered halls where no hunger existed, no sorrow, no decay. There, food gleamed like gold, meat never spoiled, and laughter filled every corner. Time itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. For a mortal heart, such perfection was unbearable. Some said that those who ate the city's food were transformed, their skin growing pale, their eyes reflecting the stars, their voices soft as wind. They became part of the song itself, woven into the harmony of the other world. Others claimed they remained human in body, but lost their will, forever smiling, forever dancing, forever trapped in a celebration that had forgotten why it began. The Druids taught that the eternal feast was a mirror, not paradise, but reflection. It showed what happens when desire is freed from limit, when beauty no longer fades. What begins as bliss curdles into stillness. What shines too long ceases to live. To the people, this lesson was clear. The world above must change to remain alive. The seasons must turn. The fires must die, so they can be reborn. The feast beneath the earth was the warning of what happens when time stands still, when the wheel no longer turns. Yet, for all their fear, the Celts could not help but wonder. What songs did the Cide sing in their endless revelry? What truths were whispered among the wine cups of eternity? There were tales of poets and bards who returned from that place, touched by something unearthly. Their verses carried the weight of another world music that moved hearts to tears and fear in equal measure. They were called the twice-born, for they had died and lived again through the language of beauty. In one story, a wandering harpist followed the sound of music into a hollow hill. He was welcomed by the Cide, who begged him to play. When he struck his strings, they shimmered with flame, and the queen wept not for sorrow, but for memory. "You have played a mortal song," she said, "and now it belongs to us." The harpist vanished. Centuries later, shepherds found his harp buried in the hill, its strings still vibrating softly, though no hand touched them. They say that if you listen at night, you can still hear that note, faint, eternal. The feast, in truth, was neither curse nor blessing. It was the otherworld's truth made visible, that beauty and death are twin faces of the same God. The Cide did not hunger because they had already consumed everything, even time. Their laughter echoed because silence no longer existed there. To the Celts, this revelation was both terrifying and sacred. It taught them that mortality was the gift, not the punishment. The fleeting nature of life, the ripening and the rot, the flame that burns and dies was what made existence meaningful. Eternity, stripped of change, was only another form of death. Thus, when the wind carried faint strains of music across the dark fields on Samhain night, the people listened but did not follow. They stood in silence, heads bowed, offering a bit of bread to the air, murmuring, "Keep your feast below, and we will keep ours above." And when dawn finally came, pale and cold, they relit their hearths with the last embers of the Druid fire. The smoke curled toward the sky like prayer. The world, fragile and impermanent, turned once more. The hills fell quiet, the songs faded, but deep beneath the earth, the eternal feast continued endless, radiant, and still. Above the earth, the night of Samhain was dying. The fires had burned down to ash, the songs had faded into the mist, and the first breath of dawn began to gather along the horizon, pale, cold, and trembling. It was said that in this fragile hour, when night had not yet ended but day had not yet begun, the year itself turned over. The Celts did not mark their new year in spring, nor in the summer's bloom, but here at the edge of death, in the stillness after the harvest and before the frost. To them, creation began not with light, but with darkness. The seed germinated only after it was buried. The soul found renewal only after it passed through the shadow. And so Samhain was not only the end of the old year, it was the beginning of the new. The wheel had turned again, as it always did, slow and inevitable. What had died was folded back into the cycle, becoming soil, memory, and promise. The people emerged from their huts, weary but alive. Smoke rose thinly from the newly rekindled hearths. The fields, though barren, gleamed faintly beneath frost-silent witnesses to the work of time. The smell of wood and salt still clung to the air, mixed with something subtler, relief. In the sacred calendar of the Celts, this moment was the still point, the cosmic pause between what was and what would be. The Druids called it Athbliain, the rebirth of the year. The gods, they said, were sleeping, dreaming the pattern of what was to come. Every choice, every prayer, every ember from the Samhain fire carried weight, for it would echo through the turning of the next cycle. The old fires had been extinguished and relit. The spirits had been honored and appeased. The veil had opened and closed. The balance between the worlds had been restored. The tribe had faced death, spoken with its ghosts, and found meaning in their fear. Now, they stood ready to walk once more into the uncertain road of life. As the sun began to rise weak, golden, uncertain, its light fell upon the mounds and the frost-laced trees. The hollow hills shimmered faintly, as if bowing farewell. Beneath them, the eternal feast continued, hidden and distant, but the living no longer feared it. They had learned what they needed to learn, that life endures not because it resists the dark, but because it moves with it. The Druids gathered the remnants of the sacred bonfire. From its ashes, they drew marks upon their foreheads, the symbol of renewal. Children watched in silence as their elders traced a circle of soot over their brows, whispering blessings. May you walk the full wheel. May you die and live again. The circle was everything. The Celts saw no finality in death, only transformation, a return to the source. Even their gods were bound to it. The dying sun would one day rise again. The earth, now asleep, would soon quicken beneath the thaw. Nothing ended. Everything became. That belief shaped how they lived. The Celts farmed, fought, loved, and mourned with the same awareness that each act would come back around, that kindness and cruelty alike echoed across seasons and souls. Time, to them, was not a march, but a dance. On this morning after Samhain, they offered one last gift to the gods: silence. No chant, no drum, no fire, only quiet breath, and the sound of frost melting into the soil. The land itself seemed to exhale, a deep sigh after a long ritual. The Druids raised their hands to the east. "It turns," they whispered. "It turns again." Those 3 words were the heart of their faith. The wheel turns through light and shadow, life and death, creation and dissolution. And in that turning lies all truth. In later centuries, when the old gods faded and new faiths came to the islands, the people still felt that rhythm beneath their feet. The names changed, the rituals softened, but the essence endured. Candles replaced bonfires, prayers replaced chants, yet every October's end still carried that same whisper: "It turns." Even now, in distant memory, that ancient wisdom remains. The world still turns through its seasons. The heart still learns through its endings. We light our candles against the dark, not to conquer it, but to honor it, because the dark is what allows the light to return. And so, as the Celts once stood beneath their grey dawn, so too do we stand at the edge of every ending, between one heartbeat and the next. One year and another, learning again that death is only the shadow of beginning. The frost brightened, the hills quieted, the wind carried the faintest trace of smoke from the old fires, the last breath of Samhain. The year had turned, long after the ashes of Samhain had cooled, and the last echoes of its songs had faded into winter's hush. The Celts turned once more toward the hearth. They called this time the fire's return, the quiet renewal that began when all seemed lost. Winter was not death to them, it was the womb of life. The earth, though cold and bare, was only sleeping, holding within her the seed of the coming Sunday. In every hearth flame, they saw a reflection of that seed, small, flickering, fragile, but unstoppable. After Samhain's darkness, the people rekindled their fires not for warmth alone, but for meaning. Each flame was a declaration: light will come again. They believed that to keep the fire alive through the long nights was to keep the world itself alive. If the hearth went dark, so too would the bond between realms, the fragile order of creation. And so, the hearth became sacred. Families gathered around it, whispering stories of the gods and heroes who once brought fire to mankind. Lu, the shining warrior of the sun, or Brigid, goddess of poetry and flame. These stories were not mere legends, but spells to strengthen the spirit against despair. For in winter, despair was a constant visitor. The days shortened until it seemed the sun itself had grown weary. The rivers froze, the fields vanished beneath frost, and the forests went silent. Yet within that silence, the Celts heard a heartbeat, faint, patient, eternal, the pulse of the earth waiting for its own rebirth. The Druids taught that every winter carried within it a promise. Just as the gods descended at Samhain, they would ascend again when the wheel turned toward Imbolc, the festival of returning light. Until then, mankind was the guardian of the sun's spark. It was a sacred trust. Each household kept its fire burning through ritual and reverence. The flames were fed with oak, holly, and mistletoe trees tied to immortality and divine renewal. The Druids said that these woods carried within them the memory of summer. When burned, they released that memory into the air, reminding the world that warmth would return. Outside, the snow fell silently across the mounds, veiling the hollow hills in white. Beneath, the Aos Sí feasted still, their endless revel hidden under layers of ice and time. But above, the world of men moved in rhythm, with a quieter magic, the endurance of flame. There was something profound in that endurance. To keep the fire meant refusing despair. It meant honoring the invisible rhythm that pulsed beneath all endings. The Celts believed that those who tended their hearth with devotion would be protected through the cold months, that no spirit, no famine, no frost could enter a home where the flame still breathed. At the turning of the year, a new ritual began. From the great communal fire of Samhain, now reduced to embers, The Druids carried a single spark to each village. They wrapped it in peat and ash, protected like a child, and delivered it to the chieftain's hearth. From there, it was shared house by house, spreading warmth through darkness like veins of gold. This was called the new fire, and it symbolized rebirth. It was said that the fire of Samhain represented the death of the world, while the fire that followed the fire that returns was its resurrection. To receive it was to be reminded that death had done its work and given way to life. At night, families would sit before their new flames and tell stories of the sun's descent into darkness and its long climb back to the sky. The children listened wide-eyed, clutching blankets as sparks drifted upward like lost souls finding their way home. The elders spoke softly, their words rhythmic, hypnotic, as though the stories themselves were embers, keeping time alive. In one tale, the sun was said to be a great warrior who descended into the underworld every winter to battle darkness itself. He fought not with sword or shield, but with light, each sunrise a stroke of defiance against the night. And though he seemed to weaken as the days grew short, the people believed he never truly died. He rested, gathering strength for his return. Thus, when the first longer day came, when the dawn lingered just a little longer on the snow, the people would whisper, "He rises again." The fire in their hearths, tended for months, was proof of that faith. It had outlasted the longest nights, burned through the silence of despair, and stood as witness to the unbroken rhythm of the world. In that warmth, they found hope, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet, patient kind that glows steady beneath the ashes. The Celts did not see time as something to conquer, but to accompany. The fire that returns was not victory over winter, but conversation with it, a recognition that darkness, too, was holy. For only through the dark could the light remember what it was. And so, as snow melted and the rivers began to move again, the Druids would bless the ashes of their winter fires, scattering them over the fields. The earth received them like old friends. What had burned became nourishment. What had died became life. The wheel turned, the year renewed, and in the soft crackle of every hearth, the Celts heard the same ancient truth whispering through time. The fire always returns. When the fires of renewal had settled, and the first warmth of belief lingered in the hearths, the land itself began to sleep. Not the sleep of death, but the deep, breathing slumber of transformation. The Celts called this time the dreaming of the earth, when all living things withdrew into silence, and the world sank inward to dream itself anew. Winter was not emptiness. It was contemplation, the slow turning inward of every spirit, from the smallest seed to the mountain itself. The rivers ceased their song, the trees folded their voices, and even the wind moved as if treading softly over sacred ground. To the Celtic soul, the world in winter was alive in another way, dreaming its next creation beneath the stillness. The Druids walked through the sleeping forests with reverence. They said the earth was thinking, and that to walk loudly upon it was to disturb her dreaming. Each step in snow was a prayer, each breath a vow of patience. In these months, no great rituals were held, no fires blazed in the open air. Instead, the people turned inward to their homes, to their hearts, to their ancestors within. It was the season of stories. With the harvest complete and the fields resting, the tribes gathered indoors to weave memory and myth together. The oldest among them told of how the gods, too, once slept retreating into the underworld to dream the shape of spring. The people understood that to rest was not to waste, but to prepare. Just as the seed must hide in soil before it can bloom, so too must the soul hide in silence before it can awaken. Children listened in awe as flames flickered on the walls. Outside, frost pressed against the windows like silver lace, but within, the room was filled with warmth. the warmth not only of fire, but of remembrance. These winter nights, they believed, were sacred bridges between past and future, when the world breathed so slowly that time itself could be heard moving. The Druids taught that dreams were not personal, but cosmic fragments of the earth's own vision. When a person dreamed of green fields or flowing water, it was not merely imagination, it was the voice of the land whispering through them. Sleep, then, became a holy act, a participation in the dreaming of the world, and the earth dreamed of life. Beneath the frozen crust, roots moved quietly, weaving through the dark like ancient serpents. Deep within, the seeds stirred, remembering the sun, though they had never seen it. Water gathered in secret channels, patient and sure. Everything slept, and yet everything prepared. The Celts saw in this slumber a kind of wisdom, that rest itself was a form of faith. To pause, to wait, to trust the dark, these were acts of courage. The dreaming earth did not rush its rebirth. It unfolded it slowly, like breath after long sorrow. In the heart of winter, the Druids would often meditate in solitude, listening to the land. They said that if one was still enough, one could hear the earth's heartbeats slow, vast, and endless. It was the sound of eternity wrapped in silence. They called it Anail Natalun, the breath of the earth. This was not a metaphor to them. It was reality. The earth was alive, conscious, divine. To be human was not to rule it, but to belong to it, to share in its sleep, its hunger, its awakening. Even the constellations seemed to honor this pause. The long nights of winter revealed the cold clarity of the stars, scattered across the heavens like seeds of fire. The Celts watched them, tracing the paths of gods and heroes frozen in celestial dance. They believed that as the earth dreamed below, the sky watched above two lovers facing each other in silence across eternity. And within that silence, humanity found peace. There was no urgency, no harvest, no war, only the soft labor of the unseen, the hidden work of roots and memory. The Celts learned that not all creation was loud. Sometimes it came as stillness. In this dreaming world, they whispered blessings to the soil. Sleep well, old mother. Dream deep. Dream green. Their prayers were not for miracles, but for patience, for the courage to wait until the earth herself was ready to awaken. And when the snow began to melt and rivers to sing again, they would say the earth was stirring from her dream. Spring did not arrive with noise or triumph, it arrived like memory returning. But before that moment, there was the quiet, the long, beautiful quiet, the kind that feels eternal, where nothing moves, and yet everything is becoming. In that quiet, the Celts found themselves reflected fragile, fleeting, yet part of something vast and breathing. They too were seeds in the soil of time, and like the earth they learned to rest, to trust, to dream. The dreaming earth, silent, patient, holy, carried them through the cold months until the first thaw whispered of return. And when the rivers finally broke free and the blackbirds sang again, the people looked to the sky and smiled, whispering what they had always known. The earth remembers. It began as a whisper, a single thread of pale gold stretched across the horizon. After months of shadow and silence, the light returned, not in triumph, not in thunder, but softly, like the slow exhale of the earth awakening from a long, sacred dream. The Celts greeted this dawn not with noise, but with stillness. They stood at the thresholds of their homes, breath steaming in the chill, watching the first sunlight touch the frost-bitten fields. It shimmered faintly, fragile, yet alive, like hope itself reborn. To them, this was Imbolc, the festival of the quickening, the moment when the seed within the soil stirred, when the heart of the world began to beat faster once more. Though the ground remained cold and the air still bit at the skin, Something invisible had shifted. The earth had turned in her sleep. Life, though unseen, was rising again. The Druids taught that this light was not new, but returning the same eternal flame reborn through cycle and time. They called it the child of the sun, the spark that had slept through the dark months and now reached toward the sky like a breath finding its body. To honor it was to remember that even the smallest flame holds the memory of the great fire. In every village, the people rekindled their hearths with care. The fires that had burned low through the long winter were fed with fresh wood. The smoke curled upward like prayers, carrying gratitude for survival and promise for renewal. Women laid white cloths outside at dawn gifts for Bridget, goddess of flame and fertility, who was said to walk the fields on this day, blessing the land for spring. The return of light was not only the sun's victory, it was the triumph of patience of all that had endured the cold, the hunger, the silence. The Celts did not believe light destroyed darkness. They believed it grew from it. The night was not enemy, but mother the womb, from which dawn was born. Children danced around small fires, their laughter echoing through the crisp air. Elders smiled quietly, knowing that each spark rising into the sky was more than flame. It was proof that life continued its endless rhythm. The people sang old songs, not of conquest, but of balance. They thanked the dark for its lessons, the earth for its dreams, and the light for its return. To the Celts, light was more than warmth or vision. It was knowledge, the illumination of the soul. When the first rays touched their faces, they believed the gods were speaking through sunlight, whispering, "You have endured. You are renewed." The Druids led simple rituals upon the hills. They lit candles in a circle, each flame representing a life, a hope, a prayer. As the wind swept through the grass, the flames wavered but did not die. "See," they said, "the spirit trembles but endures. As above, so below." And so the people learned again the lesson written in every season, that death was not the end, but the turning, that even the darkest night cannot forget the shape of the morning, that the wheel, once begun, can never stop. The returning light revealed the outlines of what had been hidden deer tracks in the snow, buds swelling on branches, faint green beneath frost. To eyes accustomed to grey, these were miracles. The Celts saw them not as signs of spring's arrival, but as the earth remembering her own promise. Bridget's fires were lit across the land in homes, in fields, on stone altars left from ages before. People brought offerings of milk, bread, and seeds, symbols of nourishment and birth. Some left small dolls woven from straw to represent the goddess herself, reminders that life is both fragile and eternal. As day lengthened, the world seemed to sigh with relief. The rivers thawed, the ravens grew quiet, and the hills shone faintly under the returning Sunday. The long dream was ending. But the Celts did not forget the darkness. They carried it with them, not as fear, but as wisdom. For only by remembering the shadow could they truly honor the light. The Druids said that within each person burned two fires, one that shone outward, lighting the world, and one that glowed inward, lighting the soul. To live well was to tend both. So, as the sun climbed higher, the people turned from prayer to action, clearing fields, mending tools, and preparing for planting. Their movements were humble, yet sacred. Each act of labor was a continuation of the ancient covenant, that life must always feed life. In the soft gold of morning, the Celts felt the world exhale a long, gentle breath of awakening. The frost melted from the stones, the birds began their calls, and the scent of damp earth rose like incense. They lifted their faces to the sky and whispered, not in triumph but in gratitude, "It returns, it always returns." And somewhere, deep within the soil that had dreamed through the long winter, Roots trembled with the same truth. The light had come home, and so it ends, or perhaps it never does. For the Celts, there was no true ending, only the circle, the slow, eternal turning of all things. Every fire that dies becomes ash. Every ash feeds the soil. Every soil births the seed, and every seed carries again the flame. This was their faith, their comfort, their truth. Nothing ends, everything returns. The wheel had turned once more. Samhain's shadows had yielded to winter's sleep. The dreaming earth had whispered her visions. The light had returned. Now, the people stood at the heart of that turning, not at its beginning or end, but within its endless motion. The Druids called this understanding, Aisling and Roth, the vision of the wheel. They taught that life was a song, not a straight road, but a rhythm, a pattern of breath and silence. The gods moved within that rhythm. So did the moon, the tide, the heart, and even the stars. To live rightly was not to resist the turning, but to flow with it, to dance in harmony with the wheel's unseen pulse. Every festival, every season, every birth and death were simply notes in this great melody. The Celts saw themselves not as masters of the world, but as one voice in its song. To them, even sorrow had a place, for it carved space for joy to fill. Even loss was sacred, because it cleared the ground for new life to rise. As the fires of Imbolc burned low, and spring prepared its quiet entrance, the land breathed evenly again. The rivers sang, the hills softened, the crows gave way to skylarks. The great circle, life, death, and return, had completed one revolution. Yet even now, it was already beginning another. The people gathered once more around the hearths that had seen them through the cold. They told stories of the wheel, tracing its path through memory. Samhain, the descent into shadow; winter, the dream of the earth; Imbolc, the return of light; spring, the awakening; summer, the fullness of life; and back again to Samhain, the sacred ending that was always a beginning. They did not see the passing of time as decay, but as continuity. To die was to give back, to live was to borrow, to exist was to share in the breath of everything. The Celts believed that even the gods obeyed this rhythm, dying and returning through the changing face of nature. The sun, too, followed it, burning and fading, only to rise once more. The Druids taught that within every person was a small version of that cosmic wheel. The heart's beating mirrored the pulse of the earth. The inhale and exhale of the lungs echoed the tides. Dreams and waking followed the rhythm of the seasons. To be human was to carry the world inside oneself. And so, they lived with awareness, tending the soil, the fire, and the spirit with equal care. For to harm the earth was to wound their own circle. To forget the gods was to lose balance. To neglect the flame within was to drift into shadow without return. Harmony, not victory, was the highest virtue. In their rituals, they often drew the Triskele three spirals intertwined, representing the eternal unity of life, death, and rebirth. Each curve flowed into the next, without beginning or end. This symbol adorned stones, jewelry, and the wooden doors of their temples. To trace it with one's hand was to remember the promise, you will return, you always will. At the close of the year, the Celts would stand upon their hills, looking over fields washed in gold light, and feel the quiet satisfaction of belonging. The wind on their faces, the warmth beneath their feet, the song of the river in the distance, all were voices of the same circle, singing softly, you are part of me, as I am part of you. And when the Druids spoke their last blessing, it was never farewell, only reminder. As the seed becomes the tree, as the tree becomes the flame, as the flame becomes the wind, and the wind becomes the rain, so too does the soul turn, again and again and again. The people repeated the words with reverence, their breath weaving with the wind. Around them, the land shimmered with quiet life. The fires burned down to embers small, red, eternal. Night descended, gentle and patient. The stars above mirrored the sparks below, both wheels turning in their own vast harmony, the sky and the earth dreaming together. The Celts had no need for endings. The story continued, as it always had. The wheel turned, the fire breathed, and the earth remembered. And somewhere, beneath hill and sky, between shadow and light, the voice of eternity whispered through all things. Nothing dies, everything returns.